Hey guys, Jen here. Running a couple minutes late and trying to get this damn camera to sit properly. All right, welcome to the live stream. Today I'm going to be talking you through my Write Your Damn Novel process, which is basically the process that I created for myself to help me take all of the story ideas in my head and actually develop them out into a story that I could write down on paper. Difference when it came to actually being able to implement all the stuff that I was learning in workshops and reading books and working with mentors and coaches was that it was all great information and I learned a lot from them and I sort of knew what I had to do, but the problem was no one was really showing me how to take all that information and actually use it in my own story. So the disconnect I was having was that, yeah, okay, now I know what craft is and I understand structure and all of this other stuff, but how do I implement? Like, how do I take all the stuff that I've been learning and actually use it in a story? So I wasn't sure how to do that. And so what I did was I created this process, which I'm going to talk you through, which has helped me immensely in just creating my own stories, but then also I've been teaching this process to other writers for the last 7 years. And as I've refined my own process and gotten more and more just clarity on each part of it, I've developed more of it. So I've actually gotten to a place now where I've got about an 8-step process, and each little step breaks it down into a bite-sized chunk, which then by the end allows you to have a full story plan, fully developed and ready to write. So that for me is something is a non-negotiable. So I refuse to write without that. And I will invest the time, take the extra time to actually I'll go out and come back in case it's my phone. There's no sound for some reason. Okay, that's weird. Well, let me see. I was having some connection issues before. I don't know if maybe that was the problem. We'll see. Let me know, because I don't know if I can find out for myself. I'm going to try to put it on my Facebook page and see if I can hear it. Yeah. Okay. So it must be your phone, because I'm hearing it on here. It's okay. You can hear me now. Okay, good. Yeah. So hopefully it was just, like I said, I was having a connection issue before. So maybe that's part of it too, was that maybe the internet was just really slow or something. And actually, before I jump into this, I just want to share this. Yeah. All right, cool. Okay, so like I said, I created this process for myself because I just realized that while I had learned so much from working with mentors and reading tons of craft books, I mean, here's just the top shelf here is a selection of many craft books that I've read over the years now. That's just what I still currently have. I've obviously had a whole lot more than that, but I definitely got rid of a bunch of stuff over the years as I felt like I didn't need that one anymore, or I was over reading it, or I was done and I wanted to pass it on. But all of that stuff was great, understanding craft, reading books, etc. But the problem was I still couldn't connect it. I couldn't, okay, I see what I need to do, but how do I actually do it now? And I think that was the thing that a lot of people weren't teaching or weren't talking about. And so I was struggling a lot with it because I just wasn't sure, what do I do now? How do I do this? And so, like I said, I created my own process, and it has helped me to just break down bite-sized chunks of how to take my idea and turn it to an actual story and then actually write it. And so by using this planning development process, it has allowed me to write my first drafts so much faster than I used to. So it used to take me months. I mean, I'm talking like half a year or more just to write my first draft. Now I plan my story out ahead of time, and yeah, that does take me some time. But I put a deadline around it, and then I actually get started writing, and I can write my first draft in 30 to 60 days without a problem by having that story plan. So it helps me a ton to spend that extra time on the planning process. Okay, so the first thing I would say is when you're ready to start taking your idea and actually turning it into a story, the first thing that you want to do is that you want to give yourself a time frame. So tell yourself, okay, I'm going to be planning the story for the next month or the next 6 weeks or whatever you decide is going to be how much time you need. Now, the process I use is about 8 weeks, so I definitely recommend a couple of months of planning, if not more. My very first story that I published, Soundcheck, that one, it took me 8 months to plan. So I actually planned it for 8 full months, not in a row because I was sort of not in the habit of doing the work every day at that point, but I definitely was doing it as much as I could at the time. And then, just whenever I could work on it, I would. And if I didn't have time, I would just sort of not do it. Now I don't do that anymore. So now, that was years ago. I've got a habit now of writing every day and working on my stuff every day. So every single day I'm working on something, even if it's only for 15 or 20 minutes. And so that helps me a lot because I'm able to just know that I'm committed to doing something every day. And it doesn't have to be, so you give yourself a time frame. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I'm just going to do this for the next 6 months. Like, just set yourself a deadline and say, okay, for this month, I'm going to be working on planning and developing my story. I'm going to give myself at least 15 to 20 minutes a day, every single day, to work on this. And that's it. And just give yourself the deadline. So you sort of have time for a couple of things. So first, having the deadline is going to push you to actually do the work and show up every day and work on your story. But then it's also going to give you the space that you need to marinate on your ideas and to play around with different options so that you're not forcing yourself into, oh, I've got to get it all figured out right now. Because you really don't. And even though I recommend planning, you still are going to have some freedom when it comes to writing the draft, because even with a story plan, with it fully developed, all of your scenes, you're still going to come up with, how am I going to write the scene now? Because you're not writing the scene in the story plan. You're just coming up with the outline, what has to happen in the scene, what information needs to be in there, that kind of thing. But you're not writing out the actual prose of the scene until you sit down and actually write your draft. So it's still creative, even though you're planning, because you still have to figure out how to implement in the actual wording and writing the story out. So anyway, that is just sort of how you get started, is just give yourself a time frame or a deadline to say, I'm going to take this much time. Because the other thing is, if you don't give yourself the deadline, you could plan forever. I mean, technically, you could just keep planning and developing an idea and never actually sit down and write it. So that's why I think it's super important to have a deadline to say, okay, I'm giving myself this much time, this is my deadline, and if I'm not done by this date, then wherever I'm at, I'm going to just start writing from here or whatever. Now, I mean, I don't recommend starting to write if you're just completely not sure of your story at all. If you just took the time to plan it and you're just like, hey, I'm not there yet, well, then maybe extend your deadline a little bit. But at the same time, be careful of that, because what happens is that you'll do what I did. So you'll keep working on the story plan and 8 months will go by and you'll realize, like, oh my God, I've been doing this for 8 months. That is a long time to plan a story. And yeah, it's what I needed at the time, because like I said, I wasn't doing it every day. Now I would never want to take that much time, because I know that that's just giving myself the leeway to procrastinate and to not do the work. So if I squeeze my timeline down and if I tell myself I've only got 6 weeks to plan this story or 8 weeks to plan this story, well, then I'm going to do the work every day because I know I've only got this time frame. But then at the same time, I'm going to allow myself to have some freedom to just marinate when I feel that, okay, I'm not sure where to go right now. I'm going to give myself a couple of days off to just marinate on the idea and come back to it with a fresh mind. So that's why I would recommend having about 6 to 8 weeks in your planning process if possible. Okay, so once you sort of set yourself up with the schedule and your deadline and you know how much time you've given yourself, then you can actually jump into my process that I have for taking your idea and developing it into a story. So the very first step of this process, so the whole process goes through all of the pieces of craft. So it really looks at the most important things you should know about your story before you write it. Now, like I said, there are going to be a lot of things that you don't figure out during this planning phase. And it's because a lot of stuff you can't really figure out until you're writing. So you can figure out a lot of stuff when it comes to the actual story, but when it comes to executing the words on the page and actually writing the prose, there's not really a lot you can plan with that. Like, you sort of just have to let it flow as you sit down to write. So that's why I like the combination of the story plan and then just allowing myself to sit down and write from that, but having that freedom to know that I can be creative with how I bring it to life. Because I think that helps a lot as well, to just sort of have that balance. Okay, so the first step in the process is figuring out your concept. So if you were part of my challenge that I did last week, so I did a free challenge last week, and I did 5 days of just explaining how to do concept and plot, so how to figure them out. You may have a head start on this step. If you aren't familiar with this, you could definitely go back to check out my videos on this. So if you are on my Facebook page, click on the video link and it'll bring you to all the videos that I've done, and you'll see the 5 that I did last week that have concept and plot and all that stuff in them. So I won't go into too much detail on, all the specifics of it, but the very first step for me in my planning process is concept. So I like to give myself a week on each of these steps minimum. So I'll say, okay, a week on concept, I'm going to write down what I think my concept is, and then I'm going to play with it, and I'm going to marinate on it and just sort of give myself the chance to try other options. And then the next week, I'm going to jump into the next step. So I sort of have this process figured out based on, a week of time for each thing. So concept is your very first thing. Now, when you start with an idea, you may not have a concept yet. You may have just like a spark of inspiration, or you have some situation you came up with, or, you know, a character or something like that. So you're going to want to now think about what's conceptual about this. What can I bring to the table that's going to make it a concept? Now, a concept, just to sort of inform you if you're not sure yet, is just the landscape of your story. So it's basically the stage that your story is going to unfold on. So think of it like, you know, if this is the foundation of it, and then your actual story is going to unfold right on there. So as an example of concept, a concept could be like revenge. It could be reliving the same day over and over again. It could be, you know, the end of the world. So there's a lot of different things that could be your concept, and then that becomes the stage that the rest of the story unfolds on. So, and like I said, I did much more detail on concept in the videos from last week, so definitely check those out if you're not sure what concept is. So, okay, that's the first thing, is working on the concept. Once I've figured out my concept, then the next step is I work on a combination of my plot, my character arc, and my theme all in 1 week. Now, the reason I do all three of these together is because they actually play really well off of each other. And so what I used to do was separate them, and I used to do plot by itself, and then I would do character by itself, and it was fine. But what I was finding was that a lot of what I was developing for my character arc related to my plot, and a lot of what I was developing with my plot and my opposition and my antagonist related to that character arc that I was creating. And then, of course, character arc, a lot of times your message or the theme of your story is going to stem from that character arc. So what is this character learning over the course of the story as they transform from who they were to who they are now? And what is the message that comes from that? Because that's really what theme is what is the overall message of your story? What is it you want your reader to walk away from having felt or having thought about, or just feeling like this is the message you're sending for them? So every story has a theme. It's not always a huge theme, and sometimes it's just very basic. Like for romances, it's just love conquers all. That's the theme of every single romance story. And that's the way to just think about it, is, okay, so I like to develop what's my plot and my character arc and my theme all at one time. And again, I do this because I just see these play so tightly together that it doesn't make sense to separate them, because then what ends up happening is you have this plot and then you have a character arc, but you're like, well, crap, they don't go together now, because you came up with a totally different character arc that doesn't relate to this plot. So the reason I do them all together is because a lot of the times your antagonist and the opposition in your story is going to be what causes that inner demon to come out in your protagonist. And so the inner demon is the character arc. It's the person overcoming that inner demon over the course of the story that allows them to to change, to transform. And of course, that's their character arc. So you don't want to develop that separate from your plot, because your antagonist is going to bring that inner demon out more in your character. That's the whole point. Otherwise, your character would never have a reason to deal with it. So the antagonist is going to come into the story as opposition to what this character wants, and they are going to force them to deal with head on this inner demon that they've got going on, because if they don't, then they're just going to continue doing the same thing in life over and over again that they've been doing since the beginning of the story. So the antagonist is there purposely not only to oppose them in their goal, but also to bring out that inner demon, to just really pull it out of them and force them to deal with it. So that's sort of a consequence of having the antagonist there, is that they now have to deal with this inner demon that they've either been downplaying or hiding from, or that they don't even realize they have. So that's why I like to do character arc at the same time as I do my plot, because then I can think about them together and to say, okay, if my opposition is this, what inner demon would work with that, and sort of figuring it out from there. So like, for example, with Soundcheck, I wasn't sure about my character's inner demon for a long time. And this was before I had my process where I actually put the pieces together at the same time. And so I used to do characters separate from plot. And that was where I kind of got stuck, because I realized like, oh, well, now they're not playing together, because now I have a totally separate inner demon that has nothing to do with this opposition. And so it's a good idea to do them together so that you don't have that. So for me, when I came up with the inner demon, it was based on, well, what's her antagonist? So her antagonist is trying to stop her from getting her dream job, from getting this promotion that she's completely deserves and earned. He's trying to stop her from doing that. So there's her opposition to her goal. And then the inner demon is that she's a control freak. And so by him saying, this is what you have to do now, she can't control anything. She's basically had the control completely ripped from her, and now she has to do whatever she's being told, and she doesn't get to control it. So that was the inner demon that I chose, because I felt that that was the best one that I could have the antagonist pull out of her and then force her to have to deal with over the course of the story. Now, because I do these two things together, now it's much easier for me because I'm not having them as separate pieces. So before it was very much separate. Okay, I have this antagonist and I have this inner demon, but they don't play together. So now I have to come up with one or the other and fix it. So now I just do them all together. Plot, character arc, which again is just dealing with the inner demon, and the theme that comes out of all of that. So for me, the theme was really just trust yourself and, know that you can do anything that you set your mind to. And that was basically the theme of the story. And that's what she discovers, is that, she has to ask for help, obviously, that she can't do it alone, but also she had to trust that she knew what she was doing and that she had to stop sort of thinking that it was outside of herself. So, that was the theme that sort of came out of all of that. And the message that came out of the story was that you don't have to have somebody else telling you what to do. You can actually decide for yourself. So it was a lot of things like that all came out of that character arc and that opposition. So my second week of my story planning process is always plot, character arc, and theme. And just figuring out what is that and what is going to happen in the story and developing all the details of that. So once I've got that, then I move on to week 3, which is subplot. So then I'm actually looking at, okay, so now that I know what my main story is, because again, your plot is going to be the main storyline in your actual story, and then you're going to have these subplots. So they're going to be these little side stories that are happening through the course of your bigger story. With a subplot, you only want to have 1 or 2, 3 maximum. You don't want to have too many subplots, because what ends up happening is that you either don't tie all the pieces together or they become totally random. The thing you don't want to have happen with a subplot is that it's totally random and it doesn't connect to anything. So with a subplot, most of the time what we're seeing is another dimension or another side of your protagonist. So for example, if your protagonist is like a total badass cop, like a Dirty Harry style, and so you sort of see him being this like on personality, constantly doing what he has to do, he does his job, etc. Well, that's sort of a harder side of him. So now you come up with a subplot that's going to show us another dimension of that character. So maybe something related to their family, or a long lost child, or something that's going to just give us a new dimension of who they are and not just show us that same facet over and over again. So a lot of times that's what a subplot is you're seeing another side of this character. So if you have a character who's really evil, well, then you sort of have this subplot that shows us, hey, they actually have some humanity to them. So I was talking about the example of Mr. Brooks in my videos last week, and that movie is where the protagonist is actually a serial killer. So he's a really bad guy. He's been serial killing for a long time, and he's never gotten caught. So he's like the worst of the worst. And so in order for you to actually want to root for him and want to follow him in this story, he has to have something to him that makes him human, that makes him feel like you can understand the struggle that he's going through. And so what came in for his subplot was that his daughter has these, serial killing tendencies, basically. He doesn't want that for her. He doesn't want her to have the life that he's had, where he's been tortured by this inner voice, this, second personality that basically tells him what to do. And so he doesn't want that. He doesn't want that for her, because he knows what a struggle it's been for him his whole life. So that's one of the subplots, is that he rescues her from getting caught and then, tries to stop her from doing that anymore. So he sort of cleans up the mess that she made because she did a shitty job at trying to hide the fact that she killed somebody. So anyway, it's just bringing in that subplot. So it's showing you the other side of him. Now you're seeing a serial killer who's, he's a father and he really cares about his daughter and he loves her. And so you're seeing this opposite side of him through the story and through the subplot. And so that's what you want to be thinking about for your story, is what subplots can you bring up? They're going to tie into your character somehow. Now, if you happen to have a subplot that doesn't directly relate to your character, your protagonist, maybe you have 2 side characters who have something going on or whatever, keep in mind that should still relate somehow back to that core story. So you don't want to just have a subplot about 2 characters that doesn't tie back into your core story, because the whole point of your story is that core story thread. It's your plot. It's the actual defeating of the bad guy, dealing with the inner demon. I mean, that's your story. So you don't want a subplot that's just there just to be there. It needs to tie in somehow or relate somehow, etc. So an example I can think of is there's a movie with Mandy Moore called Chasing Liberty. And in that one, there is a subplot where 2 of the agents who follow her, so they're sort of her like protectors, they trail her everywhere she goes, they fall in love and they get together by the end of the story. Now that has nothing to do with her specifically. However, at the end of the story, it's her seeing them together that causes her to go back after the love interest who she, broke things off with because they had a fight or whatever. So Even though that subplot didn't relate to her completely, it did because, number one, they got together because they were always together following her, the protagonist, but then also they became the reason that she decides to go after the guy that she loves because she sees them being in love and she wants some of that. So it tied back into the story. It wasn't just a random subplot, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So I like to look at my subplots during week 3 of my story planning process and just to figure out 1 to 2 side things that could be happening, and then from there expanding if I decide I need more. The thing I don't like to do is to just put a bunch of subplots in there just to fill space. I don't like to do that because it just ends up being a waste of time. Don't fluff up your story just to fill the word count. So if you're finding that, maybe it's too short, okay, well, maybe you do need an extra subplot, but don't just throw something random in. Put something in there that's going to add value to your core story as it unfolds. All right, so that's the subplots. So once I've got my concept, my plot, character arc, theme, and then my subplots figured out, I can move on to week 4, which is a big one. It's a big, massive part of the story planning process, but it's super important. And in order to actually be effective with it, you have to know these other pieces that we were talking about. So that's why I do those first. Now, something else I'm thinking about during this, especially with figuring out my plot, is the ending of my story. How is the story going to end? So if you don't know the ending of your story, it becomes really, really hard to plan it out because you don't know where you're heading, basically. So if you can think of, okay, this is how the story is going to end. And even if you don't know the specific, this is how I'm going to end it, but you just have an idea of, okay, I think this is around, what's going to happen at the ending. Then you can work backwards. And especially important for week 4 because week 4 is story structure. So story structure is when you're actually going to figure out the 6 plot points that you need in your story to bring your story to life. And this is your core story now. So your structure, so this is going to be your hook, your first plot point, your midpoint, your second plot point, and your 2 pinch points. And those are going to be happening throughout the course of your story. They are basically the backbone or the spine of your story. And then all the other pieces tie into that and help to either set up that scene or to move away from it to set up the next one. So your 6 pieces of structure are the backbone of your story. Keep in mind that your structure always and only relates to your core story, which means if your core story is the girl dealing with the antagonist, then what you don't want to see at your plot points is something related to the subplot or something related to something else. Your plot points are always and only going to relate to your antagonist and to your core story, and that's it. So your subplots are still going to be in there. They're just not your specific story structure scenes. Now, this is a hard thing for a lot of writers to understand, and I think it's just because we tell ourselves that's our story. Well, then we have to have plot points for each thing. But the truth is that you don't have to have a plot point for all of your subplots. You just have your plot points for your core story. And those are only 6 out of, let's say, 60 scenes that you're going to have in the story. The rest of those scenes are bringing to life the subplot and the character arc and the backstory and all these other things. But the thing that holds it all together, and Larry Brooks likes to talk about it like a tent, so a 3-pole tent. You've got your 3 poles that are going to hold up the story, and everything else either goes up to the next one or away from the other one. So it's sort of like looking at a circus tent, like he says. And so think of it like that. Well, these plot points are only 6 scenes/moments in your story. You still have to have another, 54 more scenes that have to happen. So that's where your subplot comes in. That's where your character arc, that's where the backstory comes in. But don't bring those moments in at your plot points because your plot points are not meant for that. They're meant completely to be related to your core story, your core antagonist, and whatever is actually happening in the story. So then I work on structure. That's the next thing. I sometimes will take a couple of weeks on structure. So like I said, I usually do this in 8 weeks, but sometimes I will push some of that back more because I like to have more time on the structure. Because again, nailing the structure is the thing that's going to help you bring the rest of the story to life. Because once you know your specific plot points, it's very easy to know, okay, well, since I know that this is the first plot point, then I know that these 5 things have to be set up before we get there. And I know that in order for this plot point to work later, that I have to set up these 5 things and I have to foreshadow this. And so it sort of informs the rest of the story. Whereas if you don't have the structure in place, it's very hard to know what to do. And the complaint that I often hear from most writers is, well, I'm okay setting the story up and I know how to end it, but in the middle I get stuck. Well, guess what? The middle is your story. I mean, really, if you think about it, the first plot point is the very first milestone that starts the story. So you have a hook early on that's just going to hint at something that's coming, but everything that happens before your first plot point is just setup. We're just getting set up for what's happening where we're going to go with the story. Your actual story begins at your first plot point. So if you think about it, that's the middle of the story. That's the most important part. And that's the part that most writers tell me they have trouble with. Like, I don't know what to do in the middle. I get stuck. I only know the beginning and the end. So this is why I say it's so important to plan out your story and to figure out your structure, because when you know the structure points, then it's easier to figure out what has to happen in each part of the story in order to get to that, plot point, but then also to bring the rest of the story to life. So structure is a super important piece of your story planning journey. Do not skip it. Spend time on it. Work hard to understand what the purpose of all the plot points are, because the whole idea is a plot point represents a certain thing. It has a mission to involve or to put into the story. It has a mission. It has a purpose. And if you don't actually know the definition of the plot points, if you don't know how to bring them to life, then you're going to actually be giving your story a disservice or doing a disservice to your story, because you're not really bringing it to life like it could be. So I'm not going to go into all the details of what the plot points are and all of that, because that's actually something I'm doing in my workshop, which I'm going to tell you guys about after this is done. But if you do want to learn more about that, I've had tons of videos on it. You can go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jennifer Blanchard. Tons of videos on structure, plot points, anything you need to know about story. I've done tons of videos on it. So you can check that out there. But that's week 4 of my process, is story structure. Now, once I've got my story structure figured out, the next step, week 5, is the story roadmap or the scene roadmap. So what I do in that case is I'm just figuring out now, okay, I know my plot points. The next step is what has to happen to get me to the plot point, what has to happen to lead away from it to the next one. And that's all I'm figuring out. Larry Brooks talks about this as a beat sheet. So it's the idea that you're going to come up with little beats. So basically like a sentence for each scene of what you're going to have happen in there. He says mission driven, meaning you're looking at what is the mission of this scene? Like, what is the purpose? How does it move the story forward? And that is what you call your beat. So it's basically like, okay, this is my first plot point. So then this is my inciting incident, or this is the thing that sets up what's coming. And you sort of just write all the little story beats out. Now, you're probably going to have about 55 to 60 of these, depending on your story. You may have more. It's going to also depend on your genre and all of that. I like to sort of think in an average of about 60 scenes, 55 to 60 scenes. And so I'm always looking at sort of, the other thing is balance. So just making sure that you don't have 50 scenes in part 1, and then after your first plot point, you got 4 scenes, and then we're at the midpoint, and then we've got 25 scenes. You want to make sure you're balanced. So what I like to do is I'll take a document and I'll write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, number all the way to 14. Scene 14 is my first plot point, or scene 12 is my first plot point. So I usually do it around between 12 and 14 scenes in, and then I figure out what are the rest of the scenes that I need to get me to that point. And I have worksheets and things that I use for this now, but when I was first starting, it was literally just take my notebook, number the page, and write them out. And sometimes I still do that, but now, like I said, I have worksheets that I've created, so sometimes I'll just use those instead. But you're really just taking the time now to figure out what is it that has to happen in my story on top of the plot point. So now you're going to look at things like your character arc and your subplots and all of that, because now you're filling in the gaps in the story. They're going to tie the rest of your structure together. So if building the structure is your foundation, well, now you're connecting that foundation with other pieces. So I like to say, like, if structure is the spine of your story, then the scenes that fit together that actually connect the plot points are going to be like your, like your connective tissue that you have in your body. It's like they connect your bones together. It's muscles and things like that. So it's all the little pieces of your story that are going to connect all of your plot points together. And for the scene roadmap, I sometimes like to spend a couple of weeks on that too. So anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks, sometimes more. Like I said, my process is usually 8 to 10 weeks at this point, which is pared down from several months, which I used to do. And it's sort of gotten easier and easier as I've done this. So the more that I sort of go through this process, the easier it becomes the next time I do it. And so in the beginning, I didn't even have a process. In the beginning, it was like, well, how the hell do I do this? How do I implement? And now, as I've created this process and sort of honed it over the years, so it used to be a 6-week process, and now it's an 8 to a 10-week. And I sort of just play around with the pieces and refining it as I go. But definitely for structure and scenes, I'd like to sort of come up with at least a couple of weeks worth of time on that. But you don't have to. I mean, sometimes you just know the story. So sometimes, like, I just know the story and I can just write the plot points out right away, and it doesn't take me all that much time. So it is going to depend on how much knowledge you have of story structure, of how it works, how to put a story together, etc. So it's a learning curve. And I'm sort of giving you, this is how I do it, but don't freak out if you're like, I can't do it that fast. It's fine. this is just my version of the process. You can take what I'm teaching you right now and you can figure out what works for you. So maybe for you, you have to have 3 weeks on structure or 4 weeks. I don't know. It's up to you to decide that. Again, making sure that you're not procrastinating on finishing and doing the writing, because that does happen, but also making sure you're giving yourself enough time so that you feel comfortable with, I know my story, because that's the most important thing, is that you can sit down on the first day that you're going to write your draft and feel confident that you know your story and that you know what has to happen, and you're not still struggling to find the pieces. That's the whole point. Okay, so now we're up to, so once you've done your roadmap and you got your little scene beats figured out, so you know all the specifics of what has to happen, now you're going to actually expand on that into what I call a story roadmap or scene writing, which is really when now you're taking, okay, I know that what has to happen in this scene, so what's the mission of this scene? Well, I'm going to introduce my protagonist. Okay, that's what's happening in this scene then, fine. Well, now you're going to look at it from the perspective of, is this a scene or is this a sequel? Now, this is sort of more, I would say, advanced level storytelling stuff. And so if you don't know about scene and sequel yet, I would definitely recommend the book Scene and Structure by Jack Bickham. It's a Writer's Digest book. Talks all about how to structure a scene and the 2 types of scenes, scene and sequel. And I can, mention a little bit about that, but like I said, it's not something I'm going to go into a ton of detail about because I've got a workshop coming up that I'm going to be teaching that in. So, but the idea here is you're taking your beat sheet now and looking at all the missions of each of these scenes, and you're developing them out into an actual scene. So in your scene, you're going to want to know, okay, well, if this is a scene, where's it taking place? What time of day is it taking place? What has to happen in this scene? What characters are in this scene? What's the location? Like all of the little pieces that are now going to actually bring that to life. So my story roadmap is me taking these little beats that I came up with and fleshing it out into an actual scene outline. So again, I'm not writing the prose and I'm not figuring out specific words that I need to write at this point. It's literally just what has to happen in the scene, what information needs to be executed in this scene, so that I'm aware of, okay, in this scene she has to find out these 3 things, because if she doesn't, then it won't set up the next thing that comes, etc. So you're sort of looking at each scene on its own now and saying, okay, if this is a scene, that means that there's another person, there's some sort of conflict that's going to be going on. Who is the opposition going to be in that scene? If it's not the antagonist, it's something else that's causing conflict. But whatever you do with a scene, the very end of it is always going to be a setback that's going to cause the character to now have a setback in their journey and have to do something else moving forward. So that would be a scene. Now, a sequel is basically when you see the character thinking through things, trying to figure out what to do next, really just playing through in their head what just happened. So a lot of times you'll get a sequel scene right after a first plot point. Not always, because sometimes the first plot point pushes you immediately into running or being chased or something like that, but not always. So sometimes your first plot point, you get your setback, which is obviously the introduction of the antagonist, the opposition, and all of that. And then you get a sequel where now we're seeing this character try to figure out what just happened. They're sort of thinking about things, etc. And then at a sequel, the ending is a decision. So the character decides something that they're going to do in the next scene or that they're going to take on. And then the next scene is an actual scene again where we're going to have something conflicted happening and, of course, another setback in their journey. Now, the whole scene and sequel thing is sort of like a puzzle that you're going to put together. It's not a formula. So we talked about this last week in the videos about the idea of formula. There is no formula. It is not a formula to say you have to have a scene and then a sequel and a scene and a sequel. It's not a formula because you could have 2 scenes and then a sequel, or you could have 3 scenes and then a sequel, or you could have, 3 scenes and 2 sequels, although I don't recommend that too much because sequels are usually the downtime of a story. It's sort of the slower scenes where we're just sort of decompressing or gathering our thoughts again after all these crazy things that just happened. So it's sort of just a moment for the character to breathe. The other thing is that scene and sequel help with pacing of your story. So actually pacing it out so that it's not too fast or too slow. And so that's the other reason to sort of understand this stuff, because it makes a huge difference. And like I said, Scene and Structure is a great book that tells you all about this stuff, and he dives much deeper than I'm about to. So definitely check that book out if you want to see more. But if you watch movies now, you can see this happening, and you can almost ask yourself, did that scene end with a disaster or some sort of setback? If it did, you know it was a scene. If the scene ended with a decision, so the character decided to do something or decided to try something or decided to run and hide, then you know it's a sequel and that the scene is going to be what comes next. So you can sort of look at it by watching it come to life on a story or on a movie screen. It definitely makes a big difference because you can see it happening in action. So that's your scene writing. So that's really taking your beat sheet and now developing it into actual specific scenes of what needs to happen, so that when you have all of that, you have your roadmap now to sit down and start writing. Okay, so then the final thing in the actual planning process before you're going to actually be ready to sit down and write is going to be the writing voice. So in this case, it's twofold. So the first is, what point of view are you telling the story in? So are you telling it in first person present? Are you telling it in third person past? Are you telling it with an omniscient narrator who is going to know everything that's happening? Or are you telling it with a limited narrator who's only going to know certain things, etc.? So you're sort of figuring out what POV are you going to use in this story. That is a part of your writing voice. It's a part of how you're going to bring the story to life. Then the other factor of writing voice is just you as the author. What is your writing voice? How do you write? How do you put words together? What words do you choose to use? All of that stuff is going to come down to your specific way of writing and who you are as an author. So you're not really going to plan that stuff out. It's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about the point of view that you're writing. Because, for example, let's say that your story, you keep telling yourself you're going to write it in first person, but you usually write in third person and you've never really written in first person. Well, the writing voice is going to be slightly different because of that. And so for that reason, it's important to think about this and to think, well, okay, if you are going to write this in first person, do you have the skill to do that? Or do you need to practice more or spend more time studying how to write first person well? That was something that I had to do because I always wrote in third person. That was always how I wrote stories from, age 11 when I started writing stories up until now. I always wrote in third person. But the problem was my genre that I write in. So I write chick lit, which is basically women's fiction with romantic undertones. Not a romance story, but it has a romance subplot. Those are 99% of the time written in first person. So for that reason, I had to learn how to write well in first person, because otherwise I'm going against my genre, which maybe is okay. But the whole thing is that I'm trying to, be in that genre. And if I don't write in the way that they expect, then it doesn't count for that genre. It's something else. It's the same thing with like romance. If you're writing a romance, there are very specific things that have to happen. Like I said, your theme is always love conquers all. You don't have any other choices if you want to write a straight romance. It has to be love conquers all. That's romance. If you have a different theme, then it's not romance. It's something else. But if you're writing romance, your theme is always love conquers all. Same thing with the ending. Always has to be a happy ending or a happy for now ending. There cannot be any depressing, bad, they don't get together endings, because that's not romance. So if you have an ending like that, that's fine, but you're not writing romance. So just keep that in mind, that if you write in a certain genre or you want to write in a certain genre, that you need to know what are the nuances of this genre. And for me, that was, I know that people write in first person. That's the kind of story, because most of the time you're getting a first person account of a woman character who is going to go through some crazy struggle and come out the other side stronger. That's the story. And so for that reason, I understood that I had to learn how to write in first person. So that was something that I had to practice, had to learn. I wrote Soundcheck completely in first person. It was one of the first times where I did it and felt like I did a good job at it. But it took me a lot of practice to get to that point, because I was always used to writing in third person, which is a totally different voice than writing in first person. So looking at both of those things, what is the best point of view to tell your story? And maybe you thought you were going to tell it in first person, but if you think about the third person version, you might have a better story. You might have more compelling story, because now you can show us stuff going on in other characters' heads that we couldn't see before because it was first person. Because remember, first person, you're only getting the account of that one character and nobody else. And yes, there are now, so it used to be where people recommended don't mix point of views. If you're writing first, stick with first. Now that's not the case anymore. You can definitely do multiple points of view. You can definitely have multiple voices. The thing to keep in mind is, number one, you have to do it well. So if you can't do it well, you're better off backing off and being a little bit more straightforward with it than trying to do all this crazy stuff, especially in your first story, because what ends up happening is you can't do it very well because you don't know how to do it yet. So it just becomes a big old mess. So in that case, I just say, choose just one voice for this story. Write that really well, and then your next story maybe take on something a little more challenging. But for your first story, yeah, it's ambitious to write, a story in some other genre you've never written in with 5 different narrators and all this stuff, but it's going to stop you and hinder you from having a good story because you don't have the skill in that yet. And so, yeah, you're practicing and that's fine, but if you actually want to do something with it, just keep in mind that you may want to be more straightforward in the beginning just so you can get practice with going all the way. Because I think what happens is we get excited about this, oh, I'm going to do this story with 5 narrators and blah, blah, blah. But then you don't finish because you get halfway through and you're not sure where to go. Or you get to the end of the draft and you're like, this doesn't work, or I don't like this, or it needs work. And then you don't actually finish. That's a big problem here, is that no matter what you're doing with your story, no matter how many times you've written a draft, if you have not gone all the way, revised that draft, and hit publish on it, then there's something not working here. And it could be your planning process, or it could be the fact that you just get stuck and you don't know where you're going, or that you continually try to be overly ambitious. The thing you have to watch out for is that you don't want your story ambition to be bigger than your story skill set. So if you don't know anything about structure, or you don't know a lot about writing a novel, the last thing you want to do is take on a project where you're writing a novel with 5 narrators and all this stuff, because all that's doing, you may think like, oh, it's fun, but all it's doing is making it more of a struggle for you and harder for you, because you don't know what you're doing yet. And so what happens is that you struggle through the whole thing, and then you tell yourself nonsense BS like, I can't do this, and I suck, and I'm not a great writer, and I shouldn't bother, and I'm just going to procrastinate because it's not working anyway. Well, yeah, it's not working because your story ambition was too big for where you're at currently in your craft knowledge. That's not a problem if you're willing to learn, but unfortunately what happens is that we get stuck and then we don't push through. So, that was for me for a long time. Like, I just struggled, and I was just like, I couldn't keep going. And I see this over and over again with writers who I've seen writing stories for years, and I've been doing this for a long time now. So I've seen a ton of writers who are writing stuff, and 5 years go by and they're still working on the same story. And it's like, why? Well, because their story ambition was way too big for where their skill set was. So start where you're at. Don't try to force yourself into it has to be a Stephen King level story. It's just your first frickin' story. Just write a story. Be straightforward. Write a story that works. And then as you get that under your belt and you get that practice, you can feel more confident moving into another story genre, moving into a version where you have multiple narrators or multiple points of view. But don't start there if you haven't actually finished something, because all it's going to keep doing is causing you to feel that you don't know what you're doing and you don't have the confidence, and it's just messing with you, and it really is a big problem. So again, just making sure that you are choosing the writing voice, the story, the plot, all this stuff that's going to actually allow you to finish and to get somewhere, and not just be, well, I have this huge ambition and I'm spending 5 years planning this story because there's so much that has to happen in it. That is crazy pants. Don't do that. Like, just pick a story that's very simple that you can write for the first time. This is not to say you have to publish it. It's not to say that it has to be your debut novel. It's not to say that this is the only story you'll ever write. But if you have not finished a story yet, if you have not gone all the way yet, then give yourself a break. Stop making your story ambition so big and just start where you are and work with what you've got and implement and make it work. And then from there you can grow. And that was the thing that I told myself was, I wrote this story back in 2008 that I was in love with. In love with. I could not let go of this story. I was obsessed with it. But it wasn't working. And after about 5 years of it not working, I finally accepted that it wasn't working. And I decided, okay, maybe this story is just too big for where I'm at right now, and I need to put it aside. So I didn't say I was going to not do it or throw it away or anything. It was just, let me set this story aside and work on this other story, which felt more straightforward, which felt a little bit easier for me because I could see the pieces more clearly. So that's what I did. And what ended up happening was that story became Soundcheck, which is the one that I published. And then right after I did that, I got the idea for how to fix the other story. And it would not have happened if I did not take the time to write Soundcheck, to work on a story that was very straightforward and not easy, but easy in the fact that it was different and it was a lot less complicated than the other story that I've been working on. So give yourself a break. Set yourself up for success by not forcing yourself to take on these huge story ambitions when you're just not there yet. It's okay. Nobody shoots a three-pointer from the frickin', middle of the court their first time. They stand really close to the basket and they shoot until they're good at that. And then they step back a few feet and they shoot until they're good at that. And then they step back a few feet and they shoot until they're good at that. So you know what I'm saying? The idea here is just don't overcomplicate things. Keep it simple, because that's the thing that's going to build your confidence as a writer and a storyteller. So anyway, that was sort of tangent, but I just wanted to throw that in there because I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind with a story, is that you don't have to always, it has to be this crazy big thing. It could just be very simple, just as a starting point. Again, not to say this has to be your only story, the main one you publish, or anything. It's practice. but you're practicing on something that actually works. And if you can end up with a draft that works and then revise it and keep going, you're going to feel much more confident in yourself than if you constantly take on these huge story ambitions and you can't execute on them. Because then all you do is feel bad about yourself and think you're a sucky writer or a bad storyteller. And it's not any of that. It's just your ambition was too big for where you're at currently. So work with where you are, what you've got, and grow from there. Okay, and then the final piece of the entire story planning process, which is more getting started once you're writing your draft. So now you've got your story plan, you've got your roadmap, everything is figured out, you're sitting down to write your actual draft. This is a very important part of the process, and I think a lot of people don't talk about it, don't mention it, but it does happen to everybody. And that is dealing with the BS that gets in your head when you start writing. So as you start writing, you get on a roll, you've been writing every single day, you're super proud of yourself, what's going to happen? Immediately you're going to have shit come up. You're going to have life chaos, you're going to have procrastination get in the way, you're going to start doubting yourself or having fear come in, or you're just going to sabotage the role that you've been on because it's been working too well, it's too good. This is a common thing that happens for writers, is that we are constantly in our own way. We are constantly sabotaging ourselves, constantly trying to stop ourselves from achieving things, not because we actually want to stop ourselves, but because we have subconscious programming that tells us that it's scary to finish, or that it's threatening to go all the way and hit publish, and oh my God, what could happen, and all these things. So even though that stuff maybe isn't conscious, it's still there, and it's still going to cause problems if you don't recognize it and find ways to work through it. So for me, it's knowing that stuff is going to come up ahead of time. Because the other thing I see a lot is that I'll see people plan the shit out of their stories. I mean, they've got a full story plan ready to go. And then what happens? They never start writing the draft because they'll tell themselves, I'm busy, I don't have time right now, I have to learn more about craft. I have a client I've been working with, and that was exactly what he said to me was, okay, we planned my story, I'm so excited, I've got the story plan done now, I'm ready to go. And I said, okay, your next step is to write the first draft. And he said, yeah, okay, but I think I'm going to read a few more craft books first so that I can make sure I know how to write. And I said, okay, it's fine if you feel that you need to do that, but give yourself a deadline, because the problem is if you don't do that, you'll end up spending the next year reading craft books instead of writing that first draft from the story you just planned. That is a very, very similar sabotage that most writers have, is that they'll plan their story and not actually write it. Or they'll sit down and write the story and then they never revise it. Or they never finish revising and go all the way and hit publish. So there's all these little things that get in our way. And so it's really important to have, to just know that, to have self-awareness around the fact that that stuff happens, because it will be the thing that stops you from achieving your goal of getting your book finished and getting it out into the world. So that is my 8-part story planning process. I call it Write Your Damn Novel, which is basically get your ass in a chair, do the work, show up, put your freaking energy and your time where your dream is, and get your story written and get it out into the world, because that is the whole point. There's no point of having a story idea if you're not going to put it out there, if you're not going to execute on it. So just to sort of run through the steps again, step 1 is concept, 2 is plot, character arc, and theme, 3 is subplot, 4 is your story structure, 5 is your scene beat sheet or your roadmap. Number 6 is your scene writing, so the actual scene and sequel sequences of your scenes. Writing voice is 7, so your point of view and the writing voice you're going to actually be writing in. And then 8 is dealing with the BS that gets in the way, because that is absolutely going to be a factor. And it's going to be a factor all along the way, but it's especially a strong factor when you finish the planning and now you have to write the draft. So that is why I've created the Write Your Damn Novel Nano Edition workshop, because as you know, National Novel Writing Month is coming up in November. It is about 2 months away from here, a little less than 2 months away. And so what I'm doing is creating this workshop so that not only are we going to go through all the planning stuff I just told you about, but then you're going to have support as you write the draft. So you've got that momentum ready to go for Nano. So we're going to plan for 8 weeks. You're going to build your concept, your plot, your premise, your scenes. You're going to figure out your structure. You're going to figure out your character arc, your theme. You're going to know your subplots, every little bit of your story that you need to know. You're going to have it all figured out, ready to go by November 1st, so that on November 1st you can sit down and you can start writing. And yeah, like I said, you're going to have shit come up, but that's why this is a workshop, because we're going to make sure that that doesn't stop you. So stuff is always going to come up. There's no way around it. But I'm going to help you to not let that stuff stop you or keep you from finishing. So you're going to keep going. You're going to get your story planned. You're going to write your first draft. And on December 1st, you're going to be so freaking proud of yourself, because not only did you finally do what you said you were going to do, which was write your freaking story, but you are now going to be in a place to have a decent start on a revision that you could now take that story and publish in 2018. And wouldn't that be awesome to finally get a story out in the world like you've always wanted to? So this workshop is going to help you do that. It's going to set you up for that success so you can have a first draft that's going to be usable, that you can actually do something with afterward, and not just be 50,000 words that you throw in a drawer and never look at again. Or I guess people don't print them out anymore, so it just becomes a file on your computer that you never look at anymore. So same thing. The other thing that's really cool about this is that you get lifetime access and updates, which means not only do you get updates anytime I update the content of the workshop, but when I run the workshop again, so I run it twice a year in February and in September, you get to be part of it every time. So it's lifetime access, which means when I run it in February, you are automatically in if you want to be. So I send an email out, I let you know, hey, the new workshop is starting up. If you're in, you let me know. I add you to the list, and you get to go through the workshop again. So not only are you learning a process, but you're going to get to go through the process over and over again with me, with the other students in the workshop, and just really come out the other end being a better storyteller and a better first draft writer. And that is the whole point of this. Because without a process, the ideas in your head are just going to stay in your head, and that's it. So this is going to give you that process, and I talked through the process on this live stream. So you could just take what I've given you here and walk away and use it. But if you want help, if you want somebody to support you as you go through each of these steps, if you want feedback and guidance to make sure you're doing it correctly, that you have the right things, and that you're not just going to shoot yourself in the foot over and over again because you think you know what you're doing, but you really don't, then be sure to check out this workshop, because it will change your writing life and it will make a difference for you. And I only wish that something like this existed when I was writing my first novel back in 2008, because it didn't. There was nothing out there like this besides going to get an MFA, which I didn't want to spend the money on. So it just became this battle of, well, I knew I needed to know stuff, but I didn't want to spend, $100,000 on this freaking degree because I already spent that much on my other degree, so why do I need to get a second one? But the whole point was, if something like this had existed back then, I would have been published a lot sooner than I was. And so I'm hoping that this allows you to have the support you need to get out of your head, get your story down on paper, and actually get finished so that you can move on to the next step in the process and actually complete 2017 feeling very proud of yourself and having a first draft that you can now use to turn into a story that you are going to publish or, do whatever you want to do with. So you can learn about this workshop by going to jenniferblanchard.net/nano edition. If anyone has questions or anything about what I talked about in this live stream, put them in the comments because I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap this up because I'm almost at an hour, and I believe Facebook now cuts off live streams if you go past an hour. So I'm going to cut this off now. But if you're watching as a replay and you have questions, just put them in the comments. I'm happy to answer them for you. And like I said, I would love to have you join us for Write Your Damn Novel Nano Edition. So go to jenniferblanchard.net/nano edition, NANO edition, and sign up. I'm really excited to get to work with you, and I will catch you guys next time.